And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing low pressure tracking eastward here, pushing snow into the southwest interior there from south coast of Norton Sound all the way down into northern Bristol Bay. This will be pretty light, but winter weather advisory is out for the Yukon Delta for gusty winds and some blowing snow, reducing visibilities there, and a winter weather advisory out for the eastern Arctic coast there for the snow and blowing snow up in that area. Otherwise clear and cold over the interior here with variable amounts of clouds, which will really make a difference for how cold you get, whether it's cloudy or not. And moisture streaming northward across the panhandle. That continues into Wednesday as well. And look for possible heavy snow. Klondike Highway, Haines, Skagway, becoming mixed with rain. Central areas, southern areas is plain rain. Snow here diminishing over the southwest part of the state, and surges of light snow continue to move from west to east along the Arctic coast and portions of the North Slope. Warm front shifts north of the Aleutians, pulling the freezing level up above sea level there with rain and snow in those areas. Then for the next day, strong low pressure, stronger low here moves into the western Bering Sea. Gale force winds for the Pribilofs with snow and blowing snow there as temperatures rise to near freezing, and rain and snow and gusty winds for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, all the way out to Adak and Atka. Cold under Arctic high pressure over the interior, still a chance of some light snow there for the eastern Arctic coast and North Slope, and very cold with light winds, northern Bering Sea. A little breezy here over the Copper River Basin, Matanuska Valley, with temperatures below zero throughout the entire day. And that cold weather extends all the way down to Kodiak Island. And for the coastal water forecast for the south coast here, east northeasterlies on the south coast, 30 to 40 knots. Northwest 25 for the central coast, northwest 20 for the north coast. Lynn Canal, north winds 30, gusting 45 knots. Stevens Passage northwest at 30 knots sustained. Southeast 25 for Clarence Strait with 10-foot seas. Then those winds become northwest at 15 knots or Clarence Strait on Thursday. North 15 for Stevens Passage, north winds 25 knots for the northern inner channels, and northwest winds 30 knots for the south coast. 20 to 25 knot northwesterlies in the forecast for the central coast with 12 to 14 foot seas there. North coast, north winds 15 to 20 knots with 9 to 10 foot seas. Prince William Sound for Wednesday, northwest winds 25 knots, seas 4 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, northwest winds 20 to 30 knots. And Kodiak Island, the Barren Islands, northwest at 20, north 20 Kamishak Bay. Small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet for northeast winds at 25 knots. And for Thursday, Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 10 to 15 knots. Northwest 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. Gale warnings for northwest winds 35 knots for the Barren Islands, seas at about 8 feet. And for the western North Gulf Coast, small craft advisories for northwest winds at 25 knots. And the eastern North Gulf Coast, north winds 20 to 25 knots. And Prince William Sound, north winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Kodiak Island, northwest to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots for Wednesday. South to southwest winds 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. West winds 20 knots for Bristol Bay. And for Thursday, Alaska Peninsula, south to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Northeast winds 15 knots for Bristol Bay. And Kodiak Island, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south winds 25 knots. Southeast winds 25 knots for Adak and Atka. And for the western Aleutians, east winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the next day, on Thursday, we've got gale warnings here for the central and west central Aleutians from Chitka to Atka for southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Otherwise, Kiska to Shemya, west northwesterlies 25 to 30 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, gale warnings, south winds 35 to 40 knots with 8 to 17 foot seas. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, east to northeast winds, 20 knots. Brisk wind advisories out for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island for northeast winds at 25 knots. Northeast 15 knot winds, St. Matthew Island. Winds will be out of the east at 15 knots for the Pribilofs. And then gale warnings move into those areas on Thursday. Southeast winds increasing to 35 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Northeast increasing to 45 knots for St. Matthew Island. Brisk wind advisories for the Kuskokwim Delta coast there, and on up toward Nunivak Island for east winds at 25 knots. For St. Lawrence Island and the Yukon Delta coast, winds will be northeast at 15 knots. Just 10-knot northeast winds for Norton Sound. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, again, brisk wind advisories there, Kaktovik to Demarcation Point, and west winds at 20 knots for the Prudhoe Bay area there. And for the Central Coast, west winds at 15 knots, southwest 20 knots for the western coast, east winds at 15 for the Chukchi Sea. And then for the Thursday outlook, for the Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west to southwest winds at 20 knots, central and west side, west winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea, much lighter winds now out of the west at 5 to 10 knots.